everyone. Good afternoon and welcome. I want to thank everyone for joining us today as part of the Redwood 16 Days of Activism Against Gender-Based Violence learning event to introduce and launch really our Accelerated Safety Assessment and Risk Management, or A-SARM approach. My name is Christina. I'm the Manager of Community Support and Outreach at the Redwood. I want to thank everyone and welcome you again for joining us this afternoon. To begin, I'm going to pass things off and introduce Vigisha, who's one of our resident service placement students this semester, and she's going to lead us in our land acknowledgement.
Thank you, Christina. Before we begin, I think it is important to recognize and honor where we are and our relationship to this land. Indigenous people have been calling on us to treat this recognition as a moral imperative, to reflect on who we are and how we benefit from ongoing colonialism and oppression, situating ourselves within our history and within the ongoing struggle for justice and against colonialism is a step towards embodying our solidarity with Indigenous women, girls, and 2S LGBTQ+ folks affected by colonialism and the crisis of missing and murdered Indigenous women and girls in Canada. So let us remember that the land we are meeting on is the traditional territory of many nations, including the Anishinaabe, the Haudenosaunee, the Chippewa, and the Wendat people, and is now home to many diverse First Nations, Inuit, and Métis people. Toronto is covered by Treaty 13 with the Mississaugas of the Credit. All right, Christina.
Thank you, Vigisha. Now I'd like to introduce the Redwood's Director of Programs and Client Services, who will be Judith Alcalde, who will be saying a few words on behalf of our Executive Director, Abiab Jalade.
Good afternoon, everyone. Welcome to the Redwoods Learning event held during the 16 Days of Activism Against Gender-Based Violence. As Director of Programs and Client Services, it is a great pleasure and privilege to have you all here today to learn about our new updated tool, the Accelerated Safety Assessment and Risk Management, otherwise known as A-SARM, and I'll be referring to it as A-SARM moving forward. First, I'd like to share a bit about the framework's evolution, since we can't talk about A-SARM without first discussing SARM. As an organization, it has been so very important to keep SARM alive, not only because of how critical our rigorous safety assessment is in our daily operations, but also because of the backstory and how we got here. We started on this journey back in 2013 in response to one of our residents being brutally murdered by her husband. It was a particularly dark time for the Redwood. Amid the endless difficult questions that followed this tragedy, the Redwood staff and leadership took a deep dive into examining the gaps in the GBV sector. One of the most unsettling discoveries was that virtually no shelters had formal safety and risk assessment screening protocols in place. Driven to fill that gap, we created the Safety Assessment and Risk Management tool. And over the past 12 years, we've shared this tool widely, both within the GBV sectors and beyond in Canada and internationally. A couple of years ago, we began a thorough revision of our decade-old framework. Our primary focus was to incorporate new insights on gender-based violence, to use more inclusive language and updated terminology, and to adapt it to our current times, such as taking into account the many implications arising from our digitally saturated world. The process led us down an unexpected path, as we asked ourselves how we can do better as shelters all those years ago in response to the tragic murder. We were now asking ourselves how we can do better beyond the confines of the GBV sector. With worsening socioeconomic realities making it even more challenging for survivors to escape abuse and live free from violence, while unabating femicide rates continue to rise, and demand for overstretched resources are now even further constrained by austerity measures. There is an urgency now for a collective response against GBV, and engagement at every level now more than ever. For too long, we have overlooked the potential of other service providers, whether in health, education, housing, financial, or the service sector. Ultimately, A-SARM is about casting a wider net, so fewer fall through the cracks, knowing that if we are to address GBV effectively, everyone needs to be involved. Everyone needs to be on board. A-SARM is flexible in its application and designed for use both within and outside the GBV sector. For service providers not specialized in GBV, the framework provides valuable guidance on responding effectively from a trauma-informed approach and on efficiently identifying, screening, and assessing risks within a limited time frame. Whether it is connecting a survivor with professional supports or helping devise a potentially life-saving safety plan for a survivor who has no intention of going to a shelter or contacting the police, our A-SARM provides a practical tool to help identify the warning signs or provide a safe space to open up a conversation. An unbelievably difficult first step for a survivor. Our team at the Redwood is incredibly excited to launch A-SARM into the real world, knowing that it is a meaningful step on a pathway towards safety, equity, and justice for more survivors. Thank you.
Wonderful. Thank you so much for sharing, Judith. I'm now going to start. So I've put together a presentation today to share and highlight a lot of the key features of our new A-SARM framework, approach, and tools. So we'll get through that and I'll walk us through that process now. I'm just going to share my screen. And okay, so as mentioned by Judith, today I'm going to be talking about our new Accelerated Safety Assessment and Risk Management Framework and Approach, or A-SARM. So before we begin, I'm mindful that some folks in this webinar may have more experience with gender-based violence, but I also wanted to be mindful that, as we are connecting with service providers external to our sector, not everyone may have the same familiarity with gender-based violence. And so I wanted to start with a bit of a definition around it, talk a little bit about what are some forms of abuse, examples of abuse, and then we'll get into the actual tools framework as well as the case scenario and example. So gender-based violence is defined as any form of abuse that is perpetrated against an individual or group because of their actual or perceived gender, sexual orientation, gender expression, or gender identity. And I also want to make note that women, girls, and especially trans and gender diverse individuals tend to be among some of the most vulnerable to violence just due to unequal power relations in our society. And especially within the A-SARM framework, part of why we wanted to use the term gender-based violence rather than intimate partner violence or domestic violence specifically was we really wanted to capture that these types of abuse and harm happen in so many different situations and contexts, whether it's someone experiencing abuse and harm from more than one person, so perhaps it's a spouse and in-laws or other family members, or there could be instances as well where, maybe they're experiencing abuse from a landlord or if it's someone who's experiencing harm from a caretaker, things like that. So we really wanted to capture the different contexts and situations in which abuse can happen. And we just felt gender-based violence was a more overarching example of what that looks like and how folks come to our shelter, but also access these services in different ways. When we talk about abuse taking different forms and that it doesn't need to involve physical violence, a lot of times when people think of abuse and harm, they tend to think of the physical. And so, that could be things like if someone is being hit, slapped, punched, kicked, bitten, things like that. But of course, those aren't the only forms of abuse. It can also be financial in nature. So if someone is, controlling how much money they have access to, controlling the way they spend money, or not allowing them to have access to a bank account, putting debt in their name, things like that. It can also be technology based. So if you have someone who's maybe being threatened by social media DMs or text messages, emails, or being stalked or surveilled through their tracking devices, location settings. And we'll talk about some protective actions a little bit later on of things people can do to navigate some of these risk factors. But other things also include emotional, verbal harm, psychological harm. So any type of coercive control, as well as sexual harm. So if, someone's even tampering with like their birth control or forcing them or pressuring them to have sex when they don't want to, things like that can be examples of gender-based violence and the different forms that it can take. So now that we've talked a little bit about gender-based violence, it's important to understand, so how do we recognize some of these signs of abuse? And part of this really is through creating a supportive environment for survivors, and being aware of some of those nonverbal indicators, maybe things that we may not be able to necessarily always see, but can alert us to someone potentially being impacted by abuse. So of course, these are just some examples of signs, and it's not limited to just this. There can be other things that can indicate this as well. So maybe, someone we're connecting with has a lot of unexplained injuries or is frequently injured. This could also look like potentially someone sharing, of past or past injuries that, they never had treated, things like that. Perhaps someone was preventing them from accessing medical care. And there can also be visible signs such as bruising, scratches, bites, burns, and so on. It could also be someone attempting to conceal physical signs. So maybe they're wearing sunglasses inside or using makeup, or, maybe they're wearing a sweater, but it's 40 degrees outside because they're trying to conceal bruises on their arms, for example. So again, these are some things that might indicate to us, maybe there's something going on that we want to kind of connect with the person for. There's also could be maybe you've noticed some changes in their behavior. Maybe they started engaging in negative self-talk or talking down to themselves, or maybe they've expressed having a lower self-esteem. They could also be presenting with low mood, hopelessness, or increased anxiety. They might appear to be more fearful or hypervigilant. So that could look like, for example, if someone, maybe they get a call from someone or they get messages from this person and you just notice their body tense up or they seem nervous or things like that. That might indicate that they're being a little more hypervigilant. Maybe that person's making them a little nervous. Maybe there's something, that we want to explore further with them. It could also look like the person appearing to be socially isolated or withdrawn. Maybe they mention having financial difficulties or limited control over finances, not able to access a bank account, things like that. It could also look like disclosing changes in their sleep pattern or appearing more tired. So again, these are things that we would want to keep an eye out for as potential signs that someone, may be experiencing abuse, especially if there's multiple things kind of going on at the same time. Would definitely want to inquire a little bit more with that person. And we'll talk a little bit about what are some approaches to those conversations that we can have. But before we get into that, I do want to just make a quick note on some high risk considerations. So, when we're looking at cases of gender-based violence, they can be quite complex. And the risk level is not always associated to simply just the number of risks appearing alone. Of course, that can be a good indicator of their level of risk, but it's important to not minimize that, this person's at a lower level of risk, so there's no need to be concerned. That's not the case. Things can change quite quickly, or things can escalate quite quickly. And so they may go from a low level of risk to being at a more moderate or high risk level. And so I'm going to share in just a moment some examples of what are some high risk things that could come up for a person that could indicate they're at that higher level of risk. And so, again, it's important to understand these factors. I mean, before using any assessment tool, but also with the A-SARM as well. And so when these high risk factors are present, it's important that we have a conversation with the survivor just to let them know that they're at a heightened risk for serious harm and lethality, and also connecting them to specialized supports in the gender-based violence sector. As Judith had mentioned, we're very mindful that not everyone comes to shelter, not everyone calls the crisis line, and not everyone's connected to gender-based violence supports, especially maybe during their first disclosure. They may disclose to their nurse, their faith leader, someone in their community who they trust. And so we really want to give folks the knowledge and skill set to recognize some of these things. And also now we'll get into the tools in just a little bit of how you can use those to support somebody. So what are some examples of high-risk considerations? So some examples of this are things like actual or pending separation. So if the person has already left, if they're contemplating leaving, this can be quite a dangerous time for a lot of survivors, as it just puts their risk at a greater level. A lot of times in abusive situations, there's at the center of it is power and control, and that person is trying to maintain some level of power and control over them. And when they're leaving, that is slipping away and heightens their risk because maybe they're trying to, again, regain some of that power and control that they're potentially losing. And so other things that might indicate high risk considerations is if the survivor or the person causing harm, or PCH, are between the ages of 15 and 24. Again, that's just looking at people that, this might be their first serious relationship. They could be socially isolated. They could be experiencing pressures from friends, from other outside external sources. And so it just has that increased vulnerability there as well. If perhaps they've been separated from the person causing harm for a while and they now have a new partner in their life, especially if there's jealousy or obsessive behaviors present, those things could indicate higher risk levels. Escalation of violence. So anything, if abuse is happening more often, if the type of abuse has shifted, if things are increasing in severity, then that would indicate to us that there's an escalation of violence and something that we want to make note of, and especially if it's happening a lot more often, because then we would really want to step in and intervene to support that person. Again, some other things include if the person has access to or possession of any firearms, if they've ever choked or strangled the survivor in the past, any obsessive behaviors displayed by the person causing harm, if there was any prior assault on the survivor while pregnant, and then any prior destruction or taking of the survivor's property can also be indicators of high risk considerations. Again, these are just some examples. There are additional ones as well. And I also just want to make note that these high risk considerations were pulled from the Ontario Domestic Violence Death Review Committee based on their recommendations, based on the high risk factors that they noticed in cases that they were reviewing. So for anyone who's unfamiliar, the Ontario Domestic Violence and Death Review Committee launched in about 2003. And every year since then, they've been examining every case that is connected to a death related to domestic violence. And that's where these high risk factors get compiled. And they look at, how many of these cases are intimate partner violence, domestic violence, strangers, and that kind of thing. So, now we've recognized some support, or we've recognized warning signs of abuse. We, know some high risk considerations, but if someone comes to us and they disclose abuse, we have a feeling that maybe, there's something going on. What is a way that we can have that conversation with them? How do we help them open up? And these are just some tips and examples of ways that you can do that in any conversation you're having with a survivor. And if you do think someone's experiencing abuse, there are ways you can ask them questions like, for example, maybe you've noticed someone that you connect with quite often, maybe they've become more withdrawn lately or they're isolating themselves. Maybe you make a comment like, I've noticed that you've been a little more withdrawn lately. Is everything okay? Is there anything I can support with? And those are ways that you can kind of open up the conversation if that is something that the person chooses to share with you. But so some other examples of how do we integrate this into our conversations, into our approaches to support this person. Key things is being kind and understanding. It is so important to show compassion, to validate the person's experiences, listening to their story with empathy and avoiding judgment can really be key pieces to making them feel seen, heard, and like it's a safe place to share. And also really letting the survivor lead. So in any disclosure of abuse or even any assessment risk management planning, it's really important that the survivor be in the driver's seat, that the plans and connections and strategies we're sharing with them, the conversations we're having, feel realistic and doable for them. And again, really making that space for them to share, in their own way, at their pace. They may be comfortable sharing a lot of information with you, but they may also be not only comfortable sharing up to a certain point, and that's totally okay. We want to give them the space to do that in however they feel most comfortable. We also want to offer breaks anytime. So if the survivor needs to pause, breathe, step away if needed. Again, using gentle communication. So paying attention to our words, the tone, the body language, really wanting to create that supportive and safe environment, and making sure that the person also feels respected as well. And then also just knowledge of resources, being familiar with local services and supports can really be helpful in providing guidance to the person, again, in helping them have that autonomy and self-determination of what are the next steps they want to take, how do they want things to look moving forward. And so on the next slide, I'm going to share a few examples of resources that are available. By no means is this a comprehensive list, but it's just to give an idea of what are some examples of supports and resources that can be available to someone who's experiencing abuse. So for anyone who's unfamiliar, there's the Assaulted Women's Helpline, which is a crisis line, but they're also connected to the Violence Against Women shelters. So we have to report our availability to them in Toronto, the GTA, and the province of Ontario. So they do know shelters that have space, and they can help connect folks to those shelters. And so again, is that they can also do risk management planning, providing some short-term guidance, support, things like that. There's also, of course, the Redwood, and we have our telephone crisis line. We also have a text line and a live chat function through idetermine.ca. So if a survivor is ever not able to answer the phone or take a phone call for some reason, they can reach out via text or via web chat to kind of also seek support and information and resources as well, and help them kind of explore that, connect next steps, and things like that. Some other resources that can be really helpful for folks is if they're looking for shelter space, there's sheltersafe.ca, and sheltersafe.ca is really great. It is basically a large map of Canada, but you can select the specific province that you're in, and it'll give you a rough idea of where the shelter is located. But more importantly, it will include that shelter's website, their phone number, the types of services that they offer on site as well as off site. And so it can be a really great resource if someone is maybe trying to think of, do I want to go to shelter? What's that going to look like? And again, they can also reach out to see if places have space, if leaving and going to shelter is something they are contemplating or thinking about. Again, I already mentioned Assaulted Women's Helpline, and then there's also City of Toronto Central Intake, but also specific cities and regions have their own central intakes as well. I also wanted to share a community support. So there's Mulberry Finder, which is through the Ontario Association for Interval and Transitional Housing, or OAIF, but they've created Mulberry Finder where folks can go online, and it's a gender-based violence services across Ontario. It's a search and database. They also have some other safety tools on there as well, but you might also have survivors looking for legal, counseling, or interpretation services. So there's services such as Barbara Schleifer Commemorative Clinic that provide those services free of cost to survivors and folks who are experiencing abuse and harm. And of course, pets can be a reason why sometimes if somebody is wanting to leave, they may not, because they're worried about what might happen to their pet when they do. And so some shelters do allow pets on site, service animals, of course, being excluded from that. But there are some shelters that do accept like pets on site. For those that don't, there's programs such as Safe Pet, where it is a fostering program where they can put in a referral and application to have their pet be in foster care while they're in shelter. And then there's also at Women's College Hospital, but at other hospitals as well. There's the 24/7 Sexual Assault and Domestic Violence Care Center. And so I've just included all of this information here as well. Lots of great resources. And again, these are just some. And one other thing I wanted to point out too about Mulberry Finder is that folks can, if they go on there, they can put in their location, approximately their postal code, and then search by radius. So that way they can kind of find any of these types of resources that I've listed here that are closer to them and in their area. And so now we're actually going to get into the accelerated safety assessment and risk management framework. As was mentioned, so when we got the funding to update the A-SARM, we originally were just planning to update the tool, but then, more and more folks from outside of the sector were reaching out to us. They wanted to learn more about gender-based violence, what they can do to support. They were noticing these things coming up a lot more in their work. And so we also wanted to make a tool that was usable by folks in other sectors or, community members that, again, we do recognize not everyone's going to call a crisis line or come to a gender-based violence service. So, they might disclose to their teacher, their nurse, whoever the case may be. And so, again, we just really wanted to equip folks with the skills, knowledge on how to support, and then also what are some tools that they can use if that feels appropriate in supporting that person. And again, it's designed to be ideal for time-sensitive situations. Our original SARM framework was quite long and extensive, and that was feedback we had heard in focus groups, both from frontline workers that had used the tool previously, but also from survivors. And so that was why we really wanted to make this accelerated version to make it more accessible and easy to use for folks. And so what are the A-SARM tools? So it starts with our step one, which is our safety screen snapshot. And that is a 13-question assessment tool, and it's designed to assess the survivor's level of exposure to gender-based violence. So those first 6 questions are looking at indicators of psychological harm, coercive and controlling behaviors. And in just a moment, I'll walk us through an example and show you what the kinds of questions it asks. And then questions 7 to 13 are looking at those indicators of higher risk factors and also that lethality piece, which is where those high risk considerations from the Domestic Violence Death Review Committee are coming into play. Because again, that's going to indicate a higher level of risk. But then I'll also explain how that works in the scoring piece of things in just a moment. And so the next and second step of this phase is our accelerated safety assessment and risk management tool. So again, this is really, we're looking to get more information on the survivor situation, get a little bit more detail. And you'll notice it's kind of going through a little bit of their history of that situation. Because again, this will help us determine what is the intervention needed, what's the level of action required, and next steps. But also the A-SARM is categorized based on risk factors, and it's in 12 sections. I've listed a couple examples here on the slide as well. So it's things like controlling behavior, if there's children or stepchildren involved, risk considerations. It also looks at things like if there's been prior police involvement, if there's any court orders or things like that in place. But again, I'll walk us through all of the tools in just a moment. And then the third and final step is the safety action plan. And that is designed to respond to risk factors identified in previous assessments. So from the safety screen snapshot and the A-SARM, we're taking that information, we're looking at what are those risk factors that we identified, were there any high risk considerations that we need to be mindful of, and then also looking at various strategies, what are some protective actions, which I'll share a couple examples in just a moment, that we can recommend to survivors, but also connecting them to support systems to mitigate their risk. And again, this should be a process that's developed in collaboration and co-created with that survivor. Again, it needs to feel realistic and doable for them and really putting them in the driver's seat of that process. Because if it doesn't feel realistic and doable, then they may not necessarily feel like it's something they can do once they've left the conversation with you. And so that's why it's really important that it kind of integrates their thoughts, their feelings, their strategies. And again, these pieces can be done whether the person is thinking of leaving the situation, whether they're looking to cope with that relationship a little or situation a little bit differently, understanding what are some strategies they can implement to manage their risk as much as possible. Or again, if they're maybe not sure what they want their next steps to be, but they just kind of want to explore what are some options, what could this look like? And so I think that's a really important piece to make note of as well. So we've talked about tools. Now let's get into what are some examples of protective actions. So protective actions are steps that can be taken by a survivor, service provider, or anyone else that can help kind of increase that safety of that person and reduce the likelihood of violence. Because one thing I also want to mention, we can never fully, truly guarantee a person's safety. That's part of why we call it a risk management plan, is because we want to help that person understand what are the risks and how do they mitigate those things as much as possible. And so some examples of this and some common ones is location tracking. We all carry devices with us, whether it's our Apple Watch, our wireless headphones, our cell phones, our tablets. And so it's really important that if someone is deciding to leave, or whether that's going to shelter or staying at a friend or family member's home who, the person causing harm is not aware of that location, it's really important that they turn off their location settings on all apps, on all of their devices. Also, things like not sharing their location in real time on social media can help minimize that as well, because it can be an easy way for someone to try and find them and track them down as well. Another example of a risk is if there's limited or no access to individual finances. Are they able to open a bank account in their own name or getting paperless statements? Are they able to make a safe and confidential email? Are they able to potentially keep some cash on hand? Those are things that we would want to explore. And also kind of in that same note on technology, looking and checking their devices for any spyware or keylogging programs, deleting their web browser history, cache, saved passwords, and also creating any new accounts. So, things like their email, if they have a shared Uber account, Amazon, social media, a lot of times it's recommended not only to change their passwords, but just to make new accounts of these things. So that way the person does not have access, cannot try to track down their location and things like that as well. And while talking about tech safety, I also want to make note of a great website that people can use that has a lot of information and resources around tech safety, which is Tech Safety Canada. And so would highly recommend that one because it gives a lot of recommendations around how do you manage those risks around technology, especially in a world where it's ever changing and ever evolving, needing to kind of update those things as the technology progresses and changes as well. And then some additional examples. So for example, safety in public spaces. So being aware and alert of our surroundings, changing daily routines. So if you always take the same bus route, switching that up, on public transit, sitting near the driver or near the emergency button. I've also heard too, strategies around sitting on those side seats where you have that more full range of motion versus having your back to a door. So that can also be a good example. And I'll just go over this last one here so that way we can get into the case scenario and example, but also person causing harm, potentially showing up at the work location or harassing. So what are some steps that people can take to help, mitigate that risk in the workplace? So, are they able to inform their employer if there's office security or colleagues about the situation? There's been times where we've had folks who are at our shelter that have been able to arrange with their employer to have someone be able to bring them to and from, let's say the office to the bus stop and back, and so on and so forth. It could also be screening their work calls, especially if they're getting a lot of like unknown calls. Are they able to potentially change their schedule, their work hours, or work location? Like for example, a few years ago, we had a resident, she worked in hospital, and the hospital she worked at was part of a large network. So she was able to not only transfer the hospital that she worked in, but also the department. And they also put some additional security measures in place for her. And so again, these are things to explore with an employer, but things that can be done to help mitigate some of that risk. And now we're going to get into our actual case scenario. And so I'm going to be sharing Layla's story. So at first, I'll walk us through the comic story of her situation, and then we'll go through the actual A-SARM tools that she completed. And yeah, so let's get into it. So a little bit of context to Layla's story. So Layla is a university student. She's currently living in residence and has been in a relationship with her partner, Beth, for about 8 months. And so this is just kind of setting up the scene. We can see here there's the external piece of Oakwood Hall residence at Oak University. And on the right-hand side of your screen, you can see, there's some folks popping their head out of doors. They hear some loud noise coming from the distance, which then brings us to the next scene where we can see it says, "You never listen. I'm trying, but," and again, we can see folks are looking. And then on our right, we see Kara, and Kara is our resident life coordinator. So she's really there to support the folks living in residence with challenges they might be experiencing while on campus. And then we can see Kara's knocking on the door, to which Beth opens the door and she seems quite upset. And we see Layla in the background who seems also quite upset. And Kara just says, "Hi, we've gotten a few noise complaints. Is everything okay there?" Beth responds and says, "Sorry, not everyone knows how to let things go, but we're good now." Kara then responds, "You sure? If either of you need to talk, I'm here." And then Beth insists, "No, we're good. Have a good night." And then she slams the door on Kara. Kara thinks to herself, "Next time I see Layla, I should check in on her." A few days go by, and Kara finally gets the chance to check in with Layla. She says, "Hey, how are you doing?" Seems like the other night was a little intense. Layla insists, "We just fight sometimes. It's probably my fault anyway." Kara says, "No one deserves to feel that way. If you ever want to talk." And Layla insists, "No, I'm fine. I mean, thanks, but Beth wouldn't like that." Kara then shares some resources. It says, "I have some resources here if you ever need them. You don't have to decide now. Just keep it somewhere private." And Layla says, "Okay, thanks." And as we can see, Kara was passing it to her in a discreet manner, something that's easy for her to hide. and that she can kind of go to if she needs. A few weeks go by and there's a knock on Kara's door. She says, "Come on in." And Layla says, "Hey, Kara, do you have a minute?" "Hey, Layla, of course. Please take a seat." She says, "How are you doing?" And then Layla shares she's not doing too good. "I can't take it anymore. Beth makes me feel like I'm worthless, but I can't be that awful, right?" And as we can see, Layla's quite upset. She's beginning to cry. And Kara is now providing that comfort to her. And she says, "You're not. What's happening to you is not okay." And in this moment, Layla opens up to Kara about her relationship with Beth. And she shares, "She said the way I dressed made her feel insecure. She got mad when I cried, said I was manipulating her. She says if I leave, she might hurt herself and that I'm selfish." Kara is now comforting Layla and says, "Oh, Layla, there's a tool called A-SARM that could help us understand what you're going through. Would you like to try it?" Layla says, "Sure." So although hesitant, she does want to try it. And she says, "I'll walk through what, Kara then says to her, "I'll walk through what it is and why it might be useful for you." Layla says, "That sounds great. Thank you, Kara." And so now we'll actually get into the A-SARM tools. I'll show you. So this is Layla and Kara have completed the safety screen snapshot together, which, as they mentioned, is that first tool in the A-SARM process. And like I pointed out, so those first 6 questions are looking at more of that coercion, emotional harm, and psychological abuse. So we can see some of the questions are asking things like, did the relationship move faster than you felt comfortable with? So examples of this could be saying, "I love you" in the first few days of meeting, or wanting to move in together, get married, or have children in the first few weeks. Some other examples are things like, do you hide or cover up the way they treat you? Do they make you feel physically or emotionally trapped and that there is no escape? And we can see to these first 6 questions, Layla has answered yes to all of them. And I'll point this out again when we get to the scoring chart. But again, this is just to show us this is how she's feeling around these questions. And so the remaining questions are, again, looking at those pieces, those higher risk level considerations, and that physical harm lethality. So again, some of these questions look like, are they violently and constantly jealous of you? Have they ever physically harmed you? Have they ever tried to choke, strangle, or suffocate you? And as we can see, Layla has answered no to all of these questions. But again, that doesn't mean that the situation may not be more complex, that she's not at a higher level of risk, even with this emotional, coercive, and psychological forms of harm that she's experiencing. So as we can see on the safety screen snapshot scoring chart, there's 3 options, and they're color coded. So you can have either a low level of risk, which is when if you answer no to questions 1 to 13. But again, if you are the person who's the assessor and you suspect that maybe there's underlying concerns, you can still proceed to the next step, the A-SARM tool and the safety action plan. Because maybe when you do, more information comes out and the person may then open up and build that rapport and connection with you a little bit more. Then there's that elevated risk. So if there's 1 yes or sometimes response given to those first 6 questions, then again, that's just indicating there's an elevated risk. We should still proceed to the A-SARM tool, making referrals and connecting them to supports as needed. And then based on the fact that Layla answered yes to all of those 6 questions, she would fall in our serious risk category, which says if 2 or more yes or sometimes responses given to questions 1 to 6, or if 1 or more yes questions were given to 1 or 7 to 13, then again, this is indicating there's that serious risk and a heightened need of urgency to proceed and to address the concerns and kind of continue to those next steps. So when we continue to the next steps, we get to our accelerated safety assessment and risk management tool. Now, I won't go necessarily through each point, but I will point out some of the key pieces from Layla's situation. And so she shares that the person causing harm, or PCH, was violent with inanimate objects, so punching walls, smashing glass, breaking furniture, and so on. And it shares, so under each of the risk factors, there's additional bullet points that you can check off. But there's also text boxes so that you can write more information, or if you need to add additional details, you can do so in that space as well. And so it says Layla shared that person causing harm punched a hole in the wall during a fight they had about a month ago, and then it made her feel frightened. Again, this is something that could also indicate to us that there's that potential that things could escalate to physical harm. And so something that we would definitely want to make note of and kind of consider as we go into that final phase of the safety action plan. And so then, again, some pieces may not necessarily have been experienced by the person. So in this case, we can say, have you, see, it says, have you experienced any of the following with person causing harm? To which Layla responds, no. So this is things like, have they prevented you from receiving medical care? Have they forced you or pressured you to have sex? Things like that. To which, again, she has said no. In this case, Layla and Beth do not have any children or stepchildren, so this section does not apply to them. But if it did, again, you would go through each of these pieces with the person, check off anything that's applicable, and again, add any additional notes to that comment section. And then the next question is asking, is the person causing harm experiencing a great deal of stress related to, and in this case, it says lack of social supports and family. It shares, Layla said that person causing harm has been feeling homesick as living on residence is her first time living away from home. Layla shared person causing harm does not have many friends at school and worries about making person causing harm feel alone if she were to end the relationship. And another important point to note here is in that comic scenario we saw, that Beth had told Layla that she might hurt herself if she were to leave that relationship. So again, these are some of those high risk considerations that we want to keep an eye out for. Again, we're looking at controlling behavior. So it says that in this case, Layla selected that Beth controls most or all of her daily activities, such as access to money, contacting family, friends, clothes to wear, things like that. And that she feels like she's been confined or prevented from leaving the house. And it says Layla shared that person causing harm often tries to control who she can hang out with on campus, tells her who she can be friends with, and on a recent occasion, person causing harm would not allow Layla to leave the room as she did not want her going to a party on campus. Again, we see some surveilling and stalking behavior. So in this case, she's saying that she's gotten some harassing calls, texts, emails, and letters. Again, there's those additional points that could be checked off if that was applicable. And then it says Layla shared that if she does not respond to person causing harm right away or stops responding after they've gotten into a fight, person causing harm will begin sending multiple messages and phone calls to her. She shared this can feel overwhelming and makes her feel uncomfortable. We then get into person causing harm's mental health and substance use. So in this case, the one that Layla felt was applicable in this situation was socially isolated from others. And again, we know she's feeling homesick, and she's feeling like she doesn't have a lot of friends on campus. And it says Layla shared that person causing harm tends to keep to themselves and does not have connections with others on campus. Layla shared person causing harm often pressures her to spend all her time with her and prevents her from seeing her friends at times. Again, this is a section that's not applicable because Layla does not believe that Beth has any access to weapons, firearms, any training licenses, things like that. But again, if this was something that was the case, then this would also be a high risk indicator and something, again, that we would want to explore more. There's never been prior police involvement in this situation. And so again, this section is not applicable in this particular instance. Then again, there's also no criminal or family court orders in this process. So this section is also not applicable, but we can see it looks at pieces like, are there, any breaches of restraining orders? Are there any parenting or decision responsibility court orders already in place? And something that we would need to be aware of in the event, let's say if this person was planning to leave, considering leaving, or has already left. And so in this case, we're looking at some risk considerations. So it says she selected escalation in severity and frequency of abusive behavior over the past year, concerns for safety for herself, and also planning to leave or have recently separated. And it says here, Layla shared she feels that the emotional, verbal, and psychological abuse and coercion has been getting more intense in the last month or so. She shared that they have been getting into fights more recently. That person causing harm has been yelling at her, calling her names, putting her down, and trying to control more of her daily life. Layla shared she's worried her living in residence could be impacted as she's received a few noise complaints when person causing harm is yelling at her. She's contemplating ending the relationship but is unsure how to proceed. She worries how person causing harm may react. And then again, some other considerations in this particular situation is she's having a fear of poverty or becoming unhoused. So in this case, because she's worried that her residency could potentially be in jeopardy due to some of those noise complaints she's gotten, she's also worried about her gender identity or sexual orientation and her age. And it says here, Layla shared she worries about getting in trouble in residence due to some noise complaints and worries about getting kicked out. Person causing harm has a room in a different residence building but spends a lot of time in Layla's room. She added she worries that being young and in a relationship with a woman that people may not believe her or take her concerns seriously. She shared she is thinking of ending the relationship and in need of support. And so now we're getting into that third and final piece, which is our safety action plan. And so, based on our judgment as Kara, who's supporting Layla, yes, we have concerns for her safety. And some of those risks we identified is we know that her housing or residence is potentially at risk. She's also being isolated from others, being prevented from going out, being told who she can and cannot be friends with, things like that. And also, too, that the abuse is happening more often, which then leads us into some of those high risk factors and indicators that were present throughout both the story and the first two sections of the A-SARM. So again, we're seeing that isolation, obsessive behaviors of telling her where she can and cannot go. She cannot go to this party, things like that. Pending separation because she hasn't ended the relationship yet. She's contemplating it, but she's also worried about what the person causing harm may do to themselves, which connects to that next high risk factor, which is threats from the person causing harm to harm themselves, or threats to do so. And then again, escalation, so it's happening more often. Survivor cause and person causing harm are between the ages of 15 and 24. Like they're only first year university students, so that's quite young. And also to survivor vulnerability. And again, this person is trying to control most or all of her daily activities. And so Layla and Kara strategize some suggestions, some referrals. The ones on the left are specific to Oak University. So she's giving her the resource of counseling services, resident support. So again, maybe this could be some advocacy efforts to help her, maintain her residence unit. Talk to someone about the noise complaints, mitigating some of that safety on campus as well. Also the number 4 security and the resident life coordinator line, which is connected to Kara and others who work in a similar role to her. And then there's also some external reports. So she gave her Good to Talk, which is an anonymous crisis line for post-secondary students in Ontario. So that's something she could reach out to if she wanted to talk to somebody. And again, I also included iDetermine so she could reach out for web chats, texting, just because I know youth don't always want to talk on the phone. So there are also text and web chat options available. And then we can see Kara and Layla have put together some safety action plan items. Of course, again, this would be co-created with the survivor that you're supporting, and so would be specific and tailored to them. But in Kara and Layla's situation, so Layla's, Kara's going to support Layla in connecting with residents management to explain the situation, and again, trying to put supports in place. Again, maybe explaining some of the why there's been noise complaints, plans to, again, help her stay safer on campus and on residents. So again, she's also going to connect with security for their Safe Walk program on campus, to get around campus, class, and back to her dorm room. If person causing harm shows up at the door, she's planning to not open it and to contact either security or Kara for support right away. She also plans to keep her room secure, so we know that she has her own room. Beth has her own room in a different residence building. And in this case, we know that she has access to Layla's room a lot. And so with the support of Kara, Layla's going to change the access code to her door so that way Beth can no longer access that room. And then it also says, so in the A-SARM, we saw that piece around the stalking behaviors with, a lot of messages. If they're in a fight, she gets a lot of messages or missed phone calls. And so Layla plans to block person causing harm's number and also social media accounts, planning to make new private accounts and changing her number as well. So again, these are some examples of protective actions she can take in her life to navigate this piece of sharing space on campus and trying to remain as safe as possible. And with that, I also just wanted to say if anyone's interested in learning more or arranging a full training with your team that goes a lot more in depth than today's webinar, please feel free to contact us at the SARM project at theredwood.com, or you can reach out to my email, cdgianni@theredwood.com. I'll also pop them in the chat as well. And now I'll stop sharing my screen so we can open it up for questions. Okay. I see a few questions, so let me just pull that up. So someone asked if they can get the presentation deck on a later date. For sure, I'm definitely happy to email the questions, or sorry, the PowerPoint slide to those who attended the session. And it says, how and where can the tool be accessed? So currently, the tool is available through training. And so if you're interested, I would highly encourage you to reach out. And again, having a more fulsome training is just as we're in the current project lifecycle. We're really wanting to promote and encourage training so that, again, we can give folks that skill set to know how to use the tools and how to have these conversations. So if you are interested, please reach out to me by email and we can definitely talk about setting up a training. Are there any other questions? No, okay. Then I want to thank everyone for taking some time out of their day, even though it's very snowy outside. And I want to thank everyone for participating in the Redwood 16 Days of Activism Against Gender-Based Violence Learning event. Really appreciate everyone taking the time to learn more about our Accelerated Safety Assessment and Risk Management, or A-SARM, approach and tools. I also just want to note, when you exit out of the webinar today, you'll have your web browser will pop up with a survey, and I'd greatly appreciate any feedback on today's webinar. So please feel free to let us know. And also with that, just a reminder that every conversation, every moment of listening, every act of compassion, these are not small gestures. They are potential turning points in a survivor's life. Through A-SARM, we're not just training people to recognize abuse or assess risk. We want to equip them to be a supportive person towards a survivor, to respond with empathy, skill, and support. At the heart of this work is simple, powerful truth. Everyone deserves to live free from violence and to be supported with dignity when they seek help. Thank you all so much again.